هؤلاء يعانوا من حالة نفسية مضطربة لأنهم هم سارقون هم معتدون.
Why does God says do not take the Jews and the Christians as a friend? We have to read the background of this incident.
You're a Muslim degenerate dog. You can't run your own countries properly.
We believe that the state of Israel will come to an end because it's written in the Torah.
There's a sense of shared scripture. Quran and Torah are both understood as revelations.
A lot of the ideas that we have today, for example, in the Middle East about Jews, about Christians, they are much more imports of 19th century colonial ideas.
Majority of scholars think that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is a political/nationalist conflict.
Where are your voices? When people are saying that I'm a terrorist, I've been called a dog, and you've all heard it. Where were your voices?
Hi, my name's Sam Myerson. I'm from Leeds originally, although now I'm a student in London at UCL, first year Classics Ancient World Studies. Originally I was born in Cardiff, and the Jewish community in Cardiff there is very small. I only lived there until I was 7, but because of the size of the Jewish community, it meant that naturally I wasn't just part of the Jewish community. My school was, I guess, a multi-faith school. I don't remember much of it because I left Cardiff when I was 7 to go to Leeds. Although I could have gone to a Jewish school, my parents sent me to a multi-faith school.
Hi there, my name is Ahmed Gokul. I am 21 years old. I've been born and brought up in London. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at Aston University in Birmingham, reading International Relations and Business. I've been brought up in northwest London. I lived in quite a multicultural area. I was lucky to have gone to school with people from all different backgrounds, different faiths and cultures. Many of my friends were Jews as well in my class. I had a high Jewish population in my class, so naturally I integrated with them, and our class was quite cohesive.
In my head there's battle on how I perceive Islam and the Muslim faith. On the one side, every Muslim I've met has been extremely peaceful, and they've been willing to talk and have discussion and dialogue, and they seem interested. On the other hand, I'm very much aware of the picture that the media give me of Islam. The fact that most terrorist attacks that are widely reported by the media are Muslim terror attacks, I think has affected my view. And sometimes when it's late at night and I'm alone and I think I'm surrounded by Muslims, I get a bit nervous. It's also because I wear my kippah, my head covering as well, so I can be identified as Jewish.
I didn't really have a perception of Judaism from a young age, purely because I saw them as my classmates, my friends, but I didn't see any sort of barrier. Growing up, obviously, you learn more about the Jewish faith, about the differences perhaps between Islam and Judaism, and the similarities, of course, as well. And I think that, you know, we live in a society where there are some sort of barriers due to geopolitics, due to international relations, due to the relationship that the conflict in Israel and Palestine has on the rest of the world and people's beliefs upon it.
Without a doubt, the tension in the Middle East has fostered a religious animosity between members of the two communities, particularly extremist preachers in the Middle East who use public platforms to spew hate on both sides.
حالة نفسية مضطربة لأنهم هم سارقون هم معتدون، والسارق والمعتدي الذي أخذ مالا بغير حق أو أرضا بغير حق يظل في اضطراب نفسي.
لو أن اليهود تركوا لنا فلسطين خلاص يبقوا حبايبنا؟ لا طبعا، عمرهم ما هيبقوا حبايبنا إطلاقا.
And these scholars, are they like religious?
Are they religious?
Yeah, as in like...
So as in, they believe in like, they have their own ideology, right? And to them, following that ideology is the true religion. So they would consider themselves religious. I personally would not consider that to be a true representation of Islam, because I believe Islam is a religion of peace.
Obviously, I feel pretty disgusted as a Jew. I don't like hearing that my whole existence is dirty and that I need to be eradicated. It's obviously not pleasant to hear. But at the same time, I fully realised that these were fundamentalist religious extremists who were talking, and nothing I could ever say or do would ever change their mind. And these people are most certainly in a minority. I know that the vast majority of Muslims wouldn't even give platform to some of them.
My first reaction, my initial reaction was of shock, not because it exists, but more so the language that was used to describe Jews as a foreign bacteria, a microbe that inhabits the earth. I think it's quite dehumanizing. In a lot of cases, it's a mandate for aggression towards the Jewish community, and I don't think that should be the case. It's clear that those who were speaking such things were predominantly clerics from Gulf states, a lot of the time who hold strong ultra-conservativist Wahhabist views, ideologies which talk about intolerance, ideologies which do not promote cohesion. And I think that these scholars who do promote such hateful ideology should not really be given the platform to do so.
والقبيحة عن طريق 3 دراسات. أولاً بنو إسرائيل في
And I think it's a shame because it trickles down, it filters into grassroots communities, communities in the West, in general Western society. We live in a world which is secular. We live in a world where Jews and Muslims and people of other faith or no faith can work together, can live together, and do so peacefully. And I think it's an absolute shame to see that those who are promoting such hateful ideologies from the Muslim community, although a minority, still have such publicity of their views.
It drives me crazy because the mass majority of Muslims in the UK and across the world promote peace, cohesion, tolerance between each other. Like, it's not even just about me tolerating you as a Jew. It's about the fact that I can actually sit with you, be friends with you, and without having any kind of discrimination.
Unfortunately, anti-Semitism within Muslim communities is often justified through some verses of the Holy Quran, which appear to directly attack and condemn Jews.
The Holy Quran does not condemn any race or ethnicity or any religious group. If the Quran condemns something, he would condemn only actions, but not people. And therefore, we hear and we read some of the verses in the Quran that condemns, the Jews, the Christians, people of the book, others, not because they are Jews, or not because they are Christians, or not because they are others, but because of certain actions that they did, which was not appropriate, and it was violation of God's rules.
Using verses 265 and 560, people accuse the Holy Quran of insulting all Jewish people, referring to them as apes and swine. However, the verses in question refer exclusively to a community of Jews who lived by the Sea of Eilat, who fished on the Sabbath, breaking the divine instruction. In punishment, God transformed those who violated the sanctity of Sabbath into apes and swine.
Quran is not anti-Semitic, neither anti any religious group. Quran is anti-injustice, anti-violations of God's rules, anti-oppression. This is the Quran. Quran criticizes the Arabs because they rejected the truth. The Quran says to Prophet Muhammad, وَكَذَّبَ بِهِ قَوْمُكَ وَهُوَ الْحَقِّ. Your community who are Arabs, who are Quraysh, the family of the Prophet, the tribe of the Prophet, they rejected this book. So, whenever there is a condemnation, we have to read it within the context, not out of context. We have to know why the Quran is condemning this group, for what action. We have to read the background of the story too. not just get things out of context and try to judge them.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء بعضهم أولياء بعض ومن يتولهم منكم فإنه منهم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين.
Now, why does God says, do not take the Jews and the Christians as friends? Is it because he has a prejudice against them? No, it's not because he has a prejudice. Neither because they are only Jews, so we hate them, or because only they are Christians, so I hate them. No. Again, we have to read the background of this incident, why it happened. So we don't just get it out of context and we translate it and we judge it. When the Prophet was in Medina, moving with his estate, trying to create a nation, the process of nation building, many were unhappy with him. There was jealousy. We have to admit to this. And many of them, they conspired. So some weak-spirited people among the Muslims, for some benefits, for some narrow interests, they wanted to get some financial aid, financial help, some business. So they conspired with some, not all, some of the Jews and the Christians against Islam, against the Prophet and his community. So God came to those weak-spirited Muslims and said to them, don't do this. This is not good to work against yourself and your community because you are making some money here or some financial or material benefit. Don't do this. And this is not only the Jews and the Christians. God said to the Muslims, even if your fathers and mothers who are not Jews or Christians, and you know who are the closest people to us? Our parents, our mothers and our fathers are the closest people to our hearts. If those people, they want to create division in your community, in your family, in your religion, then again, disassociate yourself from them. Don't be with them. Excommunicate them.
Despite the apparent difference between the Jewish and Muslim religions, there is plenty they have in common. Mark Goldsmith, a Reformed Jewish rabbi at the Aleph Synagogue in northwest London, explains just some of the shared heritage, beliefs and practices adhered by the followers of both faiths.
Most significant commonalities between Judaism and Islam, as I understand it, is that both are monotheistic religions. The idea that there's one God, there is unity, is very, very important between them. Also, the sense of peoplehood, I think, is a uniting factor between the two faiths. There's that sense that your religion is your religion, that really matters, but behind that is a sense of peoplehood that gives you a link with others who share your faith around the world. I think there are some values, such as the values of, I'll use a Christian word, charity, but we actually say it quite similarly. For us, sadaqah is the word that we use. That sense that actually it's not giving because you want to feel good, it's giving to create a sense of balance in the world and to balance things up. The Arabic words which are important in Islam are very similar to Hebrew words which are very important in Judaism. For example, when I spoke about monotheism, our word for that unity of God is echad, and I know that the word tawhid is quite similar in Arabic, describing the same kind of concept. When we understand that our word sadaqah has something very similar in Arabic as well. When we understand that our word for the Bible, the mikra, that which we read, is essentially the same root as the word for Quran. So there are many, many other similarities in that way.
I think that the belief systems that we have make for commonality. We think in many ways alike. We have a long history of following rules and commands. We have a sacred book that we tend to go to whenever we're stuck on a question. We have dietary restrictions. We share things like circumcision, and we have an interest in the world. But I think beyond that, we also have a recognised diaspora. We are not all living in the same country or in the same place, but we recognise that there are places which are very special to us, and wherever else in the world we are, so we will turn to those places, not just figuratively, but literally for prayer.
There's a sense of shared scripture. Quran and Torah are both understood as revelations. However, there's a different approach to the way you study them, the way you understand them, and though many of the characters within them are the same, and they're the same people, and the same people with their responses to God, the way in which they're expressed are quite different. But essentially, we also share that sense that we have this scripture, this text, that guides us and helps us through our lives. Torah means the 5 books of Moses, and within that, Moses is named as a prophet. Moses, who is Musa, I believe, in Quran. Miriam is named as a prophetess. Abraham is not named as a prophet in Jewish sources. However, obviously he has a similar status, and I know that he appears, of course, in Quran. Isaac, Joseph, Jacob, etc. And so Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But they're not called prophets in the way that Jews think of them. Then we have the Navi'im section, and a Navi in Judaism means a prophet, and these are the people who all Jews would consider to be prophets, and they range from the prophet Samuel to Isaiah to Jeremiah to Ezekiel to Hosea to Amos to Jonah. Many of them appear in Quran. Parts of their story and parts of their revelations appear in Quran as well. I'm not sure they're all shared. However, that's where our prophecy ceases as far as Jews are concerned. It ceases with the prophet Malachi, that no longer can we call somebody a Navi.
Along with the many theological parallels between the two religions, their position within the wider society can also be used as grounds for solidarity. In recent years, both Islamophobic and anti-Semitic attacks have been on the rise in the UK, with hate speech being wrongly promoted as freedom of speech.
Mecca could well be destroyed in the next 10 years. That's right. Some of these nutters will destroy Mecca. And you will have to learn, Allah shows no mercy. You Muslims are destroying your own culture, your own belief. I don't blame Blair and Bush for all of this. But we are seeing the end of Quranic teaching and the Third World War in the Middle East as I speak.
You're not different.
Already there is a travel ban on all laptops. Donald Trump's right.
And iPads from Middle Eastern countries.
Robert Reed passed through this park 10 years ago.
Can I ask something?
Your country was better off under Saddam Hussein, Sadiq, and you know it.
So Sam and I have just come to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. We didn't really know what to expect. I think we came here to try and see what would appeal to us, to engage in different discussions and to ultimately find more answers to our questions. I think we did so indirectly. We didn't speak to any Muslims on a one-to-one basis about Jews, or vice versa, any Jews about Muslims. But what we did see is that there was a lot of animosity towards different religions by certain speakers.
You're a Muslim degenerate dog.
Myself. What would you say to me?
You can't run your own countries properly.
My friend,
You've got Edgware Road. Do you want a jihad, an Israeli style? Because I support the chosen people to start bombing every Muslim country. Right. Israel style. And they have a democracy as we have.
A white atheist speaker which stated that he supported Israel in its indiscriminate bombings of Palestine, which, if the bombings are discriminate or indiscriminate, it doesn't matter. No one should be supporting any kind of violence. And speaking as a religious Zionist, I don't support that kind of violence.
Who was a white British male who was talking about his experiences and his understanding of Islam. I found it offensive because he was promoting intolerant ideologies. He was talking about the Quran being a book which is full of nonsense. So I asked him, how often do you read it? And then in response, I was called a Muslim degenerate dog and a potential terrorist, and that I'm a threat to London.
Not 632. Muhammad is dead. He died over 1,000 years ago. Wake up, you Muslim idiots.
So what happened to
He
you?
is dead.
Racist.
D-E-A-T. It's not racist, it's a fact.
It is hate speech.
Muhammad is dead.
So what happened to your Muslim racist? You call my friend heritage without knowing anything about it.
Jesus never existed.
I think
It's an illusion.
You're promoting hate speech. Because you called me a Muslim degenerate dog.
We can believe what we
You
want.
don't know me.
You don't believe what you want.
I was hurt, to be honest, because I felt that, I've been raised to be a contributor towards British society. I believe that British society is good. I believe that multiculturalism is what makes London the beautiful city that it is.
What about the person who killed Joe Cox? Where were you when Joe Cox was killed? Where were you when Joe Cox was killed? Were you here? Were you calling white people terrorists? No, you weren't. No, you weren't. You're calling me a terrorist. You're blaming me for the way. I'm actually proud to be British. I want to contribute to this society, but you're here trying to break the binds which hold us together. You are intolerant and you promote hate speech, not me. Not me.
Don't pray somewhere else. I believe Ronald McDonald, with Donald Trump and us, are the saviour of our democracy.
There were a few insults thrown away, although not nearly as many insults as were thrown towards the Muslims. People using Jew as a derogatory comment, which sadly something I have to live with. People insulting someone's football club that they support. They were wearing a Chelsea jacket and saying, "Why are you supporting a Jewish football club?" as means of an insult. I don't get called a degenerate, moronic terrorist, but I still have insults thrown my way. It's the little things, and they do count because it is still hate. And we should be fighting all forms of hate, not just one or another, and we should be doing it together.
Where are your voices? When people are saying that I'm a terrorist, I've been called a dog, and you've all heard it. Where were your voices? I would defend all of you. Where has anyone been for me? Or my friends here, my Jewish friends who stuck up for me. Do you guys not believe in working together? Do you not believe in cohesion?
I personally was disappointed to see that there was so much hate speech in Hyde Park, and not just towards Muslims, but also towards Jews. And we heard a lot of people throwing comments around saying, "Oh, he's a Jew, they're Jews, don't listen to them." And it's a bad representation for the millions of tourists who come here every year and who walk through Hyde Park on a sunny day like today and see that there are individuals who are promoting intolerant ideologies.
Guys like him will be every day more and more. In Germany we have the same problem. You have guys like him, they have probably no education and say, "Oh, Muslims, they are our problem." But you can't say anything. You say, "No, it isn't." And they say, "Really? All terrorists are Muslims?"
On a weekly basis. I go to university, I'm studying. But why am I a potential terrorist?
But you're a good guy, and I fully understand what you say, and I'm supporting you in your work.
What was your name, bro?
Marvin.
Marvin. Take care.
Take care.
All the best. Enjoy London.
Thanks.
Being a Jew means that you are quite often going to face ignorance about who you are and what you are and how you're part of this country. Sometimes I think for Jews, in comparison to Muslims, it can be easier in this country because Jews tend to have the same skin colour as most of the people in Britain, and that makes quite a difference. And therefore, it is absolutely critical when a Jew hears Islamophobia to say, "This affects me too. Your discrimination against a group is the same as discrimination against my group, and there should be no difference." Absolutely, we should work together and learn from each other. I feel it's a terrible thing in this country that synagogues and mosques need security outside them. There shouldn't be the situation that a place of worship needs people guarding it. It should be an open place. When this synagogue was first built in the 1930s, it was completely open. There were pictures just showing that sense of anyone's welcome just to come in. When you come into this synagogue now, you have to go through a buzzer gate, you have to go through a second gate, and we always have to keep a watching eye on what's going on around the place. That shouldn't be the case, and it shouldn't be the case for a mosque either. We're sharing that challenge in this society and many other societies.
To explore the dynamic relationship between Muslims and Jews, one must begin by examining the makeup of Arabian society during the days of Islam's inception in the 7th century.
When the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family migrated from Mecca to Medina, there were various communities in Medina. There were Muslims who accepted Islam before the arrival of the Prophet, and they came to Mecca to meet with him, and then they went back to their communities. So by the time he arrived in Medina, there were some Muslims there. There were some Christians, there were some Jews, and of course there were some, polytheists who did not believe in God, or they did not have a religion. And so the Prophet had to deal with them. This is a reality. It's a multicultural society. And the Prophet does not want to dominate that region. And he wanted to be fair to them. So obviously in the beginning he would invite them to accept Islam. When they refuse, no problem. Lakum dinukum waliya din. You keep your faith and I keep my faith, but let's put it within context. Let's regulate our relationship within certain rules.
Under the reign of the Prophet, the Jews of Medina were protected under the status Ahl al-Dhimma. They were allowed to worship in their synagogues and practice their faith without restraint. The Constitution of Medina also stated that the Muslim and Jewish communities would collaborate in the face of adversity and protect one another from external threat.
With some of them, he had good relationship. Many of them were merchants in Medina. And history tells us that the Prophet used to go and borrow money from them. Whenever he needed money, he would go and borrow money. And they would trust him. Not just him, even members of his family. Many of them, they were anticipating the arrival of the Prophet because they read in their books that a prophet or a messenger sent by God would emerge in this region. He would come. So they were anticipating him any day, any time. But when they came, when the Prophet came, and they realized he's not one of them, not one of their tribe members, they were upset and disappointed. So they chose to fight against him out of jealousy. And unfortunately, we had incidents of, skirmishes and conflicts and fightings. There were 3 tribes in Medina and some tribes outside Medina to the north in Khaybar. And so it resulted in very unfortunate, results.
Of the 3 prominent Jewish tribes, Banu Qaynuqa was the first to break the constitution. They harassed and abused some of the Muslim women in Medina. As a result, the Holy Prophet expelled them from the city. The second Jewish tribe expelled from Medina was Banu Nadir. They committed treason by assisting Abu Sufyan in his plot against the Prophet to avenge the Battle of Badr. The third tribe, Banu Qurayza, also committed treason and fought against the Prophet alongside Abu Sufyan in the Battle of Khandaq. The third tribe, Banu Qurayza, also committed treason and fought against the Prophet alongside Abu Sufyan in the Battle of Khandaq. While the Prophet thought of a suitable retribution for their treason, the leaders of Banu Qurayza requested that Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, a Jewish convert to Islam who is familiar with their tribe, make judgment instead of the Prophet, hoping he would be more lenient towards them. Instead, however, the opposite transpired. Sa'ad had just been wounded in the battle and ordered the execution of their tribal leaders, while their women and children were to be set free, along with those who took no part in the treason.
After the death of Muhammad, we don't know a lot about the Jews. By the time the light of history enters, or the light of history illumines the Jews under Islam, we do know for the most part that 90% of Jews are living in the orbit of Islam. We know that Jews are now speaking Arabic, and we also know that Jews have now entered the middle class.
We have various periods where we see this very, very close collaboration between Jews and Muslims. For example, we have Abbasid Iraq in the 8th and 9th century, where you find Muslims, Jews, Christians all engaged in translating, for example, the sources of old Greece. So you have people working on philosophy, people working on medicine, people working on mathematics. You have these sort of intellectual schools, sort of pre-universities, where people of all different religions, Muslims, Jews, Christians, work together, even atheists. You even have these reports that basically you have atheists, you have Zoroastrians, everyone working together for the greater good, working on intellectual sources, translating knowledge from all different languages. And of course, for that, you needed people of different religions. You would need the Christians to translate from Syriac sources. You would need the Zoroastrians to translate from Persian sources. You would need the Jews to translate from Hebrew sources.
Under Abbasid rule, Baghdad was an epicenter of trade in the region. The Babylonian Jews became an integral part of the developing economic environment. They eventually played a central role in the long-distance trade throughout the Islamic world and beyond.
We see this very, very close intellectual collaboration between Muslims and Jews there. We see that many of the scribes were Jewish because there is a very sort of deep love for literacy within the Jewish population. They have higher literacy rates typically than other religions.
When discussing the relationship between Muslims and Jews under the Abbasid Caliphate, there is ample evidence of collaboration between the elite aristocrats of the society. However, there is a lack of information when it comes to the common grassroots population. But in Egypt, there is a clear indication of strong relations between the two communities amongst the general public. The Cairo Geniza is a storehouse comprised of over 300,000 Jewish manuscripts found in the 1900s in Old Egypt. The manuscripts provide raw evidence detailing their strong relationship. There are thousands of trade contracts, medical documents, and religious writings in Arabic, highlighting the close collaboration of Muslim and Jewish communities in Egypt.
Through the Geniza, we can actually see what the absolutely normal population would have been like. So it's really sort of history from the bottom up, the grassroots of society, which is a bit more interesting because when we talk about elites, we know that people get along when they're very educated. But what is it like at the very lowest strata of society? That's really interesting. And that's something that the Geniza tells us. So we see that people live in the same houses. Yeah, we have houses that are shared between Jews and Muslims. We have houses that are owned by Muslims and Jews together, and then they're collecting rent. We see that, for example, Muslims would frequent Jewish doctors. Jewish doctors were quite famous in the Middle East. There's this saying in one of the historians, I can't remember who now, but they say that there's this Muslim doctor who laments that he doesn't have a Christian or a Jewish name because he's not taken seriously because everyone always just goes to the Christians and the Muslim doctors. In Spain, again, you have these very small kingdoms where you have very personal relations between basically the rulers and particular Jewish families. Again, everything really has to do with economy. I think you can only have sort of prosperous relations between a majority and a minority if the economy is going well. It's very difficult when there's no money. It's very, very difficult to be magnanimous. This is something, of course, we see now as well, right? I mean, it's no coincidence that these developments, these current developments that we see at the moment, that they come at a time when there is an economic crisis. I mean, before the crisis, there was no problem.
With the emergence of the Fatimids in the 10th century, a Shia ruling dynasty in Egypt, both Jews and Christians were granted high government positions. There were many Jewish scribes employed to translate important documents, which created a wealthy Jewish middle class. This even paved way for an official Jewish legal system, which was recognized by the Islamic government.
The Ottomans were extremely pluralist in that sense that they had these established millets, these established minority communities who were sort of self-governing, who were relatively self-contained to a degree. Again, as I said, when we actually look at the documents themselves, we also see that there is actually a lot of overlap and people they interacted on a daily basis. But at least from sort of political theory idea, you have basically different communities all in self-government and being absolutely part of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there are citizens. There are perhaps some sort of second-class citizens, but it's a proper citizenship, which Jews didn't have in Europe.
Many mark the beginning of the economic decline of the Muslim Middle East as the onset of Jewish-Muslim tension. The decline took place over a long period of time in various different regions, but during the Ottoman Empire, the general direction throughout the Muslim lands was seen as one of decline. There were many factors at play. However, the unstable economic and political situation was seen as the most significant. Under such difficulties, society became increasingly stratified, with religious orthodoxy pushing rigidity towards minorities, leading to friction between the various communities. Nevertheless, sweeping generalizations cannot be made, as evidence from the Ghanizm document suggest that relations between Muslims and Jews remain unchanged. What's more, it must be said the Ottoman Empire was still more powerful than Europe at the time, and welcomed Jews who had been expelled from Christian Spain.
A lot of the ideas that we have today, for example, in the Middle East about Jews, about Christians, they are much more imports of 19th century colonial ideas about nationalism, about what constitutes a state. Whereas the old Arab ideas, the old Muslim ideas are much, much more inclusive. So in a way, it's very interesting when we look at Islamic State, what we really see is not a revival of the old Arab ideal of a state, but we see basically an idea that is much, much more influenced by 19th century nationalist ideas, European nationalist ideas of who is actually part of the state, who owns the state.
Industrialization marked the period of European ascendancy, with rising economic and political power, resulting in widespread colonization of much of the world, including the Middle East. This period appears to have been one of the root causes of the strained relations between Muslims and Jews in the region.
Colonialism really spoiled relations between Muslims and Jews, and we see that in Algeria, where basically the colonial French forces favored the Jewish community and gave them privileges and rights that they wouldn't give to the Muslims. And of course, when you give certain privileges to a minority, then that leads to discord in the majority population. That's something that we, of course, currently see as well all over the world. So this is something where, again, the colonial powers, they, I think, also quite subconsciously, or maybe actually quite consciously, they follow this sort of divide and conquer rule, right? So you divide the communities by favoring one part, a small part, and then, of course, this leads to tensions between the minority community and the majority community.
European colonialism really began to change the makeup of the modern Middle East. Some people point to Napoleon's invasion in 1799 as the beginning of the modern Middle East. And that invasion of Napoleon was so significant because Muslims and the Arab world had always prided themselves on being, superior to Europe. But as Napoleon and his armies came over, it became fairly evident fairly quickly that Europeans had progressed in terms of not just warfare, but also in terms of scientific and technological developments. So I think that the colonialism is a big event here, and I think increasingly as we move into the modern period, Jews who are now going to come from Europe to the Middle East as Zionists are going to be seen as part of that colonial imposition into the Arab world.
So there are always particular events that we see usually cause frictions. So, for example, public display of religious symbols is one of those things. This is something that we see even today, for example, in Northern Ireland. Whenever you have a parade, that's when things go awry. That's when sort of Protestants and Catholics start fighting. And this is something that we see all over the Islamicate, that we see in Spain, that we see in Egypt, in Baghdad. When we have parades, when we have big funeral processions, when we have public display of religious symbols, that's very often when sort of clashes starts.
The State of Israel was founded in 1948, but that's almost the end product. I think that before we see what happened with the establishment of the State of Israel, we have to look at the larger context. So as I mentioned, we see a number of Eastern European Jews coming over to the Middle East in the 1880s. It's often known as the first Aliyah. And a lot of these Jews, they're Zionists, they see they see this area, Palestine, State of Israel, the Ottoman Empire, whatever you want to call it, as their ancestral homeland, and they want to begin to to reclaim it. And of course, in the process, there's also a large Arab population there. So it's really this Jewish migrants coming over from Europe, Arab resistance, and gradually we're going to see this tension. So you could say that there are a number of things that were behind the establishment of the State of Israel. One thing was Jews coming over from Eastern Europe. Another big event is the British. So that Palestine/Israel was part of the British mandate. The British pretty much promised that same part, that's a very small piece of land, to both parties. So we see the Balfour Declaration, which was issued in the 1920s, which was basically saying that the British recognized the Jews the Jews had an ancestral connection to the land of Israel. At the same time, we see documents like the Shaw Commission, in which the British seem to say that the Zionists were not treating the Arabs properly, and that the Arabs had real grievances and perhaps they needed a state. So all this is in the background. World War II is ending. The Holocaust has happened in Europe. 6 million Jews have died. I think a lot of Europeans felt guilty for this. So this was one way of this movement to establish a State of Israel. Also, Britain was exhausted after the Second World War. And in 1947, the mandate period entered. The British mandate period ended. And in 1948, we have the formation of the State of Israel.
The Holocaust is a key event in contemporary Jewish history. Not only were Muslims victims alongside their Jewish counterparts, they offered refuge to Jewish families fleeing the horrific genocide. The Wiener Library, located in the heart of London, is one of the world's leading and most extensive archives on the Holocaust and the Nazi era. It contains over 1 million items documenting the genocide, including books, press cuttings, photographs, and eyewitness testimonies.
My feelings are always very similar when I go to exhibitions such as these, because even surviving the Holocaust, everybody has a tragic story. Everyone who was in Europe and came through the Holocaust lost someone. And so I always feel very sad. I experience grief because even though my family wasn't in Europe at the time of the Holocaust, all Jews share a collective memory of the Holocaust, of the event. And so I feel pain and suffering on behalf of those who died and on behalf of those who lost family.
Walking through the Wiener Library has really opened my eyes to some of the experiences that families had during the time of the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews in the earliest 20th century. Using the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews as a justification for the human rights violations that Israel commits to the Palestinian people is perhaps semi-relevant, but at the same time we must remember that the Holocaust was an incident in which a community was persecuted purely because of their race, purely because of their genetics.
The allegation that Israelis and the Jewish people used the Holocaust to justify the maltreatment of the Palestinians, I'm not too sure how that works. I get how the Holocaust could be used to justify the existence of the State of Israel, because the Holocaust is just one example of how the Jewish people have been persecuted and oppressed throughout history. But if anyone would explain to me how we could use the Holocaust to oppress Palestinian people, I would disagree with them, because the whole point is that we suffered tremendously at the hands of others, and so we shouldn't ever oppress people again, like in any way. It doesn't matter if it's more serious, less serious. We shouldn't ever oppress people, and we shouldn't ever use the Holocaust as a way to say, we survived, we want our own country, you should get out, we're going to oppress you and do what we want. I think that's wrong.
Anti-Semitism and all and any form of discrimination towards Jewish communities, Muslim communities, and or any other community should not be allowed, should not be something which is a societal norm in the 20th century in the West, and particularly the West and all around the globe. It's time that perhaps communities start working together, that communities are able to trust in one another and work for the protection of each other.
Zionism is a European construct created 1860s, 1870s, and what it argued for was that Jews were ill-served in Europe. Jews would never be at home in Europe because of all the anti-Semitism in Europe, and what they needed was to move to a homeland of their own. At first it wasn't clear, you know, it could have been Uganda, it could have been Grand Island, New York, but it became fairly clear fairly quickly that the land of Israel, because of the deep-seated connection between Jews and that land, that Israel would be the place where it would happen. And of course, the Arabs, Arab inhabitants of that region rejected that because they were like, this is our homeland, how can you come over? And again, this is this idea of these two nationalisms struggling over one piece of land, a very small piece of land. I think, and majority of scholars think, that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is a political / nationalist conflict. That doesn't mean that religion isn't folded into it on occasion. So a lot of people that work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict talk about tangibles and intangibles. Tangibles are things that can be negotiated, things like demographies, things like refugees, things like borders. Intangibles are those things like who's been victimized more. I think religion is one of those intangibles. So religion is one, for me, is a discourse that can be applied to the conflict whenever it suits certain people. Religion is the best way to make sure, to justify or to legitimate your cause and to make an enemy of the other.
Rabbi Nathan Levy, thank you so much for joining.
It's an honor to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So Rabbi, I mean, you mentioned that you're proud to affiliate with Israel. Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, I mean, this is going to be a difficult conversation, I think. But not only am I Israeli, but I spent some time in the West Bank as a West Bank, I guess the word for it is a West Bank settler. Okay. And was there for about 5 years, living in a settlement in the West Bank.
So I mean, for me, that strikes something in my mind, because when you mentioned to me that you've lived for 5 years in a settlement in the Palestinian West Bank, I'm thinking, how can you do that? How can that be done? What perhaps made you do that in the first place?
And what dialogue is possible for someone who has that sort of ideology? Yeah. How could I do that? It's possible to take on so strongly one narrative that you forget about any other narrative. Okay. Probably we all do that to some extent. It's quite possible to use the past as a way of beating the present into shape. And I think a lot of times, a lot of people, especially in the West Bank, are so invigorated by the fact that Israel is a living entity after 2,000 years of being an exilic people, that they almost forget that when they return from exile, there are already people there. It's possible to forget about those people who are already there.
Yeah, but I mean, people generally, when you look at Israel, Palestine, and you see that the land of the Palestinians generally has been stripped down bit by bit, year on year, and to the point where you have hundreds of thousands of settlers now in Palestinian land. You know, how would you? I mean, I want to ask you something. How would you feel as a Palestinian if you were living in the West Bank and a rabbi from America has come to live next door to you?
I can't live in the West Bank anymore as a settler. I can't do it anymore, mainly because having been there and toted around an M16 to guard the little enclosed area and seeing what was being done to the Palestinian villagers on the other side, it's no longer a lifestyle that I could choose. I tend to think that ideology, and here's where faith and politics do get involved with each other, that the sense of being in Israel, in this homeland, becomes so the overriding major value that one forgets about other people, other stories, other values. And it took me actually a meeting with a rabbi who was living in the settlements, and I asked him the same question: how can you live here? How can you live here long term? Because you're a good human being, and you're a good man, and you're a good Jew, And what he said to me is he does a lot of work, reconciliation, dialogue, interfaith work. He said, I start from this point. The land's not ours, the land is God's.
Okay.
So I start from that point, and we agree upon the land, and we all love this land. And when we appreciate how much we love this land together, then there's room to step forward together. Now, it doesn't get rid of the levels of injustice, it doesn't get rid of the fact that people were, you know, in the villages next door to where I was living, had their doors broken open, them taken away at all kinds of hours of the night. And that's only what I saw. Who knows what stuff was happening I didn't see.
Yeah.
But I think if we could be in that place where we say, the land's not ours, the land is God's, and that we all love this land.
It's actually quite interesting for me to hear you, as someone who you'd call yourself a Zionist, you'd admit that you've lived in the West Bank as a settler for 5 years. But at the same time, I mean, you visited centres, you're filming with Ahl al-Bayt TV right now, you at the Al-Khoy Foundation Iftar very recently, and at the same time you've fasted in Ramadan, you've learnt about the story of Imam Hussein, and you've heard about, you know, a lot of the stories of the prophets. And I find that interesting because I think a lot of Muslims perhaps would expect that a Zionist rabbi would have no interest in the practices and the beliefs of a Muslim. Would you say that you are someone who does have interest, and would you say that you're actively working towards building bridges?
I'd like to think so. And after all, you know, as we talked about a little bit, you know, we're cousins, we're brothers, and what we share, I think, is so much stronger than what divides us.
Yeah.
I think that Muslims and Jews across the world, there is undoubtedly a bit of a tension. Clearly, some of that tension comes from something which I would say is very important to Jews, which is that sense of place and sense of land. Clearly, Israel is one of those issues which is difficult for Muslims and Jews to talk about together. Very, very important to most Jews. And the issues around Israel are difficult, I think, often for a Muslim to understand why it has its importance and why Jews see it as a spiritual centre. The tensions, I think, are mostly around the Middle East and issues around the Middle East. Community to community, there aren't necessarily deep tensions, but they can get really overshadowed by those Middle East tensions.
Whenever something happens in the Middle East, in Israel or in Palestine, whenever Israel does something, Palestinians or Arabs and supporters of Palestinian Arabs use this as an excuse to show how bad Israel is and how poorly they treat the Palestinians. So I think there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, and whenever Israel does something that it perhaps shouldn't, then there's a rise in anti-Semitism. At the same time, there's also a lot of Islamophobia in the world. So whenever Muslims do something, or whenever Palestinians do something, so for example, if a bus is blown up, then this is an excuse for Israel and her supporters to say, aha, this is further evidence of inherent and intransigent Palestinian violence. But again, I think this goes back to the point that both sides perceive themselves to be victims, and that each side perceives itself to be a more righteous victim than the other.
Right from the onset of the establishment of Israel, Haredi Jews, known as ultra-Orthodox, voiced opposition to the Zionist movement. They believe that the Jewish people should not have their own state before the coming of the Messiah. Over time, while some ultra-Orthodox Jews softened their attitudes, certain groups, such as the Neturei Karta, maintained their opposition to the State of Israel. Rabbi Beck is a leader of the Neturei Karta community in Stamford Hill, North London.
We believe that the State of Israel will come to an end, because it's written in the Torah. In the Torah it's written in Numbers, number 14, verse 41, I think. No, I was looking here on the Torah for the 5 books. Here is it. Yeah, but this is Numbers. There are 5 books. This is Numbers. Yeah. Moses said, "Why are you going against the words of God? You will not succeed." You can read it. Yes, that happened when Jews wants to go up to the State of Israel without the permission of God. After the Meraglim, when God say you have to stay in the desert for 40 years, there was people saying, no, we didn't want to wait. We will go up to the state of Israel and we take it by our hands. So Moshe say, why do you go against God? You will not succeed. So it's impossible to go against God. Yeah, of course, the Zionists already 70 years, nearly 70 years, but it will come to an end.
We just came from talking to Rabbi Beck, who's a prominent figure in the Neturei Karta. I count myself as fairly religious, but also as a Zionist, so I was very torn because I found myself both agreeing and disagreeing with a lot of what he said. So, some of what he said, for instance, we should treat everyone with compassion, respect each other, and that we shouldn't violently occupy other people's lands, I wholeheartedly agree with. But he totally rejects the state of Israel and any peace solution. So he rejects 2 states, he rejects one-state peace solution, he rejects any sort of peace solution, and that I disagree with because I'm a Zionist and I believe Jewish people have a form of home in Israel.
Zionists try to take out verses on the Torah and try to play with the Jewish religious feelings of people to bring them to their agenda. Because many people, they don't think. The Holy Land is the Holy Land, we have to fight for the Holy Land. The Holy Land is ours, we have to fight. They're confused with the concepts here. The Holy Land is very good. Of course, I want also to be there in the Holy Land. This is a very good thing. This is very good to be there. But it hasn't got nothing to do with any political, no difference who is the political leader. We have to be we have to be close to God. We want to go to the Holy Land, but it's no difference with the leader there. But the Zionists try to confuse people. Because of that, they didn't choose Uganda. In Uganda, they haven't got the Palestinians, and they haven't got so many problems what they have today. It's an empty land, it was an empty place, and they can take it with no problems. But they know that if they take the place of Uganda, even no Jew will go up there. No interest. No Jew have an interest to go up in their own state. But when they're mixing it up with the Jewish feelings, the Yale is that what people want. The strong feelings what Jews have to the Holy Land, they're mixing it up with the state of Israel. And this is confusing.
Although Rabbi Beck represents a minority group of the Jewish community in the UK, I think it's interesting that he quite clearly wants to divide religion and politics. Yet superficially you would expect that he is a political individual due to his opposition to the state of Israel. He feels that religion and politics should not have so much mixed together, and when religion becomes political and there are human rights violations, then it completely abuses and misrepresents a faith in the way it should be represented.
Many people say, oh, this Jew from the Neturei Karta opposes the state of Israel and burns Israeli flags, therefore it's fine to burn Israeli flags, it's not anti-Semitic. I would argue for various reasons it possibly is. It's not as bad as, say, going to beat someone up over your political differences, but it is a very symbolic act. It's not symbolic that he necessarily hates all Zionists, but he just doesn't agree with an established state of Israel. And the burning of the flag isn't a show of violence, as it often is when people burn, say, the American flag. They're calling for a violent end to the West. But here he's saying the burning of a flag is more of a rejection of the state of Israel and hoping that it would end. And he actually said, if it ends, it will end peacefully, so at least there's that.
So I learned a lot more about perhaps what Orthodox Jewish text says. At the same time, he spoke a lot about the relationship he has with other faiths. He talked about how Jews in other states were treated respectfully, and he gave the 2 prominent examples of Morocco and Iran. He also mentioned that he feels that any difference or friction between people of religion, particularly Jews and Muslims, is purely down to politics as opposed to any innate misunderstanding between 2 different faiths.
I think so long as there is a conflict between the two, many people will see Israelis and Palestinians, now signified as Jews and Muslims, as unable to get along, whereas we've seen throughout much of their breadth, or through much of the length and breadth of history, Jews and Muslims have gotten along fairly well, especially when we compare that to what was happening with Jews under Christendom or Christianity.
Active efforts are being made by members of the Jewish and Muslim communities to help bridge the tensions between the two. Sam met with Sayyid Ali Abbas Razawi at the IUS Interfaith Iftar to find out what he thinks the future holds for the two communities in the West.
Specifically in Britain, what do you think the relationship between Jews and Muslims is in general?
I think that the relationship is improving, and the idea is that we're from different cultures, and many a time people of different cultures tend to bunch up together. Yeah. But as you're finding second, third generation Muslims in this country, ultimately because we live in one city, for example, we're in London or wherever you're in Manchester, Leeds or so forth, the idea is that we're citizens of a particular area, and both of our religions encourage us to dialogue, to talk, to come together. And as you've seen, whether it's mitzvah day, or whether it's sadaqah day, whether it's other kind of social action works, we are coming together in times of crisis. You've got the refugee crisis, which took place where you found Jews and Muslims working together. So I think it's an evolving relationship, and I think it's a very British evolving relationship.
I just met Sayyid Ali Abbas. He was totally unlike what I expected. To be honest, I didn't know what I was expecting when I came in. I found him to be very warm and welcoming, and he struck me as being very optimistic, which filled me with a lot of hope, because he seemed to genuinely believe that relations between Jews and Muslims, at least in Britain, were improving.
For me, that's like very encouraging to hear that you think that we can all be brought much closer together through our faith. But do you think there are any like specific challenges facing, I guess, interfaith dialogue between Jews and Muslims at the moment?
You know, there are challenges. I haven't seen those challenges transpire, but I think the biggest challenge, of course, is what's taking place in the Middle East.
When I spoke to Sayyid, he filled me with a lot of hope, because he spoke on how Jews and Muslims he knew had worked out their differences. And if they can work out their differences, there's no reason that we cannot.
I remember last year we were going to Calais, and on the trip there were rabbis and there were imams. And I said, look, you know, it's important for both to listen to one another. So when the rabbi started, you could see the imams were getting tense, they wanted to answer. And I said, look, patience. And when the imams spoke, then you could see that the rabbis were getting tense and they wanted to answer. And I said, look, you've heard each other's stories now. What do you think now? And both of them replied, actually, you know what? We're all human beings. We have misconceptions. You know, we have different issues. But the fact is that we are not going to know each other's misconceptions and issues until we don't dialogue.
Islam teaches mercy and compassion, and this is what's personified within this month. We have an opportunity to show that mercy, and we have an opportunity to show that mercy to people around us.
What advice would you give to people on either sides pushing for interfaith dialogue, and like quickly what advice would you give them?
Look, in my humble opinion, the most important thing is to listen to one another and to talk less, listen more. It's an advice the Pope gave me recently, and it really resonated with me, because we have the same within our scriptures. The idea that listen more, talk less, listen to the other side, open your door up. We, as Abrahamic faiths, the one thing that we enjoy is eating together. Come and eat together, let's eat together, let's talk together, let's understand. Okay, fine, there's a whole political dimension to it, but the average person does not know what's happening. The average person may have an opinion, but I think it's important for the average people to meet, and that's when you see that things are resolved.
So I've just observed a group of Muslim men praying, and I've never been able to do that before. It's very interesting to note the similarities and differences between Muslim prayer and Jewish prayer. In both religions, during prayer, there are parts where people pray to themselves silently, and
parts which everybody joins in and is led by a leader. It's a totally new experience, and to be honest, it's quite interesting to watch and just observe the whole thing as an outsider.
By doing things at grassroots level, I think that we can make progress in creating a more cohesive community in this country where Jews and Muslims can work peacefully together in harmony and for the benefit of society as a whole.
We've been filming this, and I think I've built a friendship with you.
Yeah.
And like we've become much closer since the beginning. But generally, I mean, do you feel that do you feel more trustworthy in the Muslim community, and do you feel like you understand me better and my community better as a result of this filming?
Absolutely. Like I said before, I think beforehand I felt somewhat nervous, even about doing this documentary. A lot of my Jewish friends were asking me, like, oh, is it safe going with a Muslim TV channel? And I was quite nervous, but no, I feel like I definitely do trust the British Muslim community at least a lot more.
Yeah.
And I feel, because I genuinely felt every Muslim I've spoken to has accepted me as being Jewish. And, it makes a real difference, because I wanted to sort of reach out and learn, and people were willing to, take that metaphorical hand and lead me in.
Yeah.
When I first met you, I didn't really know what to expect at all. But, I mean, look, like, you're dressed a bit smarter than I am, but we dress the same, we eat the same, we're just not that different. And I think that's really like the main thing I've learned from doing this project.
I would agree with that. I think that there are elements within the Muslim community and also within other communities that judge the Jewish community based on the acts of political, basically, on judgment on politics. But generally, I think that, I mean, spending time with you, I've learned a lot more about your beliefs. About the way you do things culturally. You learn things in school which are very, Jewish people believe X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Like, okay, fine, that's a Jewish belief. But when you meet someone like yourself and you understand like your mentality and your ideologies and your cultural like habits, they're all very similar to mine and others generally. And that surprised me actually, because we have a lot more in common than I expected.
I suppose like faith-wise, we're cousins. That's what everyone says. Everyone, when a rabbi gets up to speak in shul about an interfaith event, he always says, "There's an event with our Muslim cousins going on this week," which is very nice. Like we're family. We come from the same place.
No, absolutely.
And now in Britain, it's our duty to sort of make sure two communities come and work closer together.
But you're always welcome. I know you live in Leeds.
Yeah.
But whenever you're in London, give me a shout. Come over home. Meet my family, and we'll go out for dinner or something.
Yeah. Likewise, if for whatever reason you somehow find yourself in Leeds.
Thank you, man. Nice to work with you.
You too, man.